Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the final session of the Virtual Rare Disease Showcase from Find a Cure. I'm still Rick Thompson. I'm still the CEO of Find a Cure. Hopefully we'll be a bit longer. I think it's gone well enough that I can feel secure in that role for a while, which is great to say. Today's final session is kind of a culmination of a lot of things we've been talking about, particularly today, but also across the breadth of the showcase. We are going to be talking about clinical trials now and the way that we're going to be revolutionizing the landscape of clinical trials in response to COVID-19. Clearly, in the rare disease world, clinical trials are tough anyway. We've got challenges in finding the right patients, challenges in getting enough numbers of patients, challenges in making the most of the data they're sharing. But when we look at what's happened this year, the challenges around social distancing, the huge burden that's been placed onto the health services to respond effectively and quickly to the COVID crisis have really made it very tough for many trials to continue. And we've seen a lot of trials halted, but equally a lot of trials trying to use a whole range of new and innovative techniques and solutions to keep things moving forward, particularly in the world of rare diseases. And we want to try and focus on a huge amount of that today, which is going to be quite interesting and quite exciting. So before we dive into our speakers, once again, I'd just like to make another thank you to those people and companies that are supporting and funding the event. Particularly thanks again to our headline sponsor, Barnacle EMAS, who really do help to make this event possible, and hopefully you've enjoyed the whole thing so far. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and we're going to dive into the panel as a whole. And I'd like to welcome to the stage our first speaker in this session. Please introduce Krista Van Kan. So Krista's been, I've known Krista for a number of years now, actually, pretty much the whole time I've been at Find a Cure. Krista is one of the founders of PSR Orphan Experts and was the former strategic director of rare diseases at ErgoMagine. Has just moved on from that company and moving on to paths new and facing new challenges. But Krista's got a wealth of experience in clinical trials and particularly how you go about delivering those clinical trials in the field of rare diseases. So we asked Krista to come today and give us a nice overview of how she sees the space right now, in particular, how we see the challenges and the opportunities in beginning to look at remote trials, home care, and bringing in some of these new ways of delivering trials into the rare disease space. So really excited to hear what you've got to say, Krista, and thank you for being with us.
All right, great. I will share my screen. Okay, so is it in the right mode?
All fine.
Good, getting
Absolutely.
the thumbs up from Rick, which is good. So thanks very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with Find a Cure. So happy to contribute to this great showcase this week, and obviously love to speak to you about rare disease clinical trials and the adaptability that we've actually been seeing, especially since the COVID outbreak. And as Rick mentioned, I will be talking mostly about the possibilities for more decentralized trials. And I know that's been mentioned already quite a lot in previous sessions, but I'm hoping to kind of summarize some of the things that have been said and obviously add some new dimensions to it as well. So just as a recap for those of you who might not be so familiar with the term decentralized clinical trials, and I'll talk about the different terminology in a moment. Traditional clinical trials were where all study visits take place at a trial site. So usually a hospital, in the case of rare diseases, very often an academic hospital or an expert site. And all study assessments, blood draws are all done at the trial site. The study medication is administered or dispensed at the trial site. And informed consent is signed wet ink at the trial site. And on the other hand, we have a completely decentralized trial where study visits can be performed in the home setting. I'll dive into that a bit deeper in a minute. Study assessments may be performed at home or by phone or video. We've heard some speakers talk about telemedicine. And of course, you can add video element to that as well. And also through electronic data collection, which obviously we've also heard quite a bit about in the last few days. Study medication can be delivered or and administered at home. And informed consent, for instance, can be obtained electronically. So just to point out the differences. And just to give you a bit of perspective on the history of these decentralized trials, actually, when I dove into this myself, I thought it was quite interesting to find that actually the first patent in the United States for trials over the internet was submitted in 2007, which was also the year that the first iPhone was launched. So I don't think that's a complete incidence because or coincidence, because obviously all this more decentralized approach to clinical trials is only possible with the more mobile technology that we've gained over the last decade. So a couple of years later, in 2011, Pfizer announced their first fully remote trial in the US, which was not in a rare disease, was in a common disease. Another 5 years later, more large pharma companies started launching virtual trials, as it's also called, virtual, decentralized, remote. And in 2016, there was also the launch of the so-called Mobile Clinical Trials Program by CTTI, that's a US-based organization. Last year, there were more initiatives started, the Trials at Home Center of Excellence by IMI, and the launch of the Digital Medicine Society. And then in 2020, COVID hit us. And obviously, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, what that means for the transition towards more decentralized. So examples of study assessments that can be done in the home environment, actually, as you can see, the list on the left possible to do remotely is substantially larger than the list on the right, which are the things that are really not possible to do remotely at the moment. So starting with the left, things that can be done remotely, I think a lot of this is quite straightforward, and we've already heard quite a lot about that as well. Obviously, interviews and questionnaires, so including questions about potential adverse events, changes in medication, in concomitant medication, etc., can all be done remotely. If there are patient-delivered questionnaires, they can be done remotely. Interview-based questionnaires can be done remotely, or by telephone or video. Collection of blood and urine samples, either by a home nurse coming into the home and making the blood draws and collecting the samples, and even doing some of the basic processing. That is something that is sometimes a limitation. Simple processing of blood samples can be done in the home. In that case, the home nurse would bring some equipment, a small portable centrifuge, and it can be set up in the kitchen, for instance, or the bathroom, and it can be done. Problems arise when very specific blood sampling or blood analyses have to be done, which require very specific processing of the sample immediately after the drawing. So that sometimes is a reason why a patient has to come into the hospital or can maybe go to a nearby lab. So that's kind of an in-between solution, not at the home, but not having to travel to the faraway expert site in central London, for instance, but maybe going to a closer by local hospital or laboratory. Vital signs can obviously be measured by a home nurse or sometimes by portable equipment, like having the patient use a blood pressure device themselves, learning how to use that. other measurements which can be done with portable equipment. Some simple ECGs can be done. That will require a professional, a home nurse to actually make that work. Spirometry, so measuring the lung function. Oxygen saturation is quite simple nowadays to measure in a home setting. And then we have, of course, all these new possibilities for electronic data collection with using mobile technology. So e-diaries, different apps, different wearables that have sensors to measure different things. Medical photography or video there are also companies, I know some of them in the UK, that just as they offer home nurses to go into the home, they also have medical photographers to go into a home to make photographs or video. And of course, administration of study medication, if it's an injection or even an IV, can usually be done in a home setting as well. What is still not possible at the moment is the medical imaging that requires these huge bulky machines like X-rays, MRIs, CT scans, etc., or other measurements requiring non-portable equipment. For instance, think of an extensive ophthalmology exam. Those types of equipment are, as far as I know, not available in a portable fashion. So that will be still something to do at a hospital. And extensive physical examination, very specific neurological examination, really requiring a specialized physician, a specialist, is also difficult. Not impossible. I know some exceptional situations where not only nurses go into the home, but even physicians would go into a home, but that's not very common at the moment. In regards to non-portable equipment like imaging and, as I said, as an example, ophthalmology, again, there is of course always a possibility to look at options of having some assessments done at a closer by hospital setting. It's not as easy as it sounds, because in that case, always contracts need to be put in place with the local hospitals or labs doing those assessments. And you have a situation where data has to be shared with the official trial site. So there are complications, but there are also possibilities to explore. So it's definitely something that patient organizations, when they're involved in the setup of a new trial, should discuss with the sponsor, with the biotech or pharma company, to see what the possibilities are to lower the burden for the patients and their families. So in regards to benefits and compromises of decentralized trials, I think we've already heard a lot of those. For patients, the most important is less travel and less impact on daily life. And it was Dan, I think, earlier today, who gave a good example of this and also said, in rare diseases, especially when it concerns a child that is quite ill, very often one of the parents has to quit their job to take care of the child, and then traveling is really tough. Also, with having other children at home, how do you take care of them? But also, people who are still in a job are not always able to take time off as much as they would need to do all these visits. And I've seen that in running a lot of rare disease trials, especially in the US, where parents just don't get the time off to take their child into a hospital, especially for a clinical trial. I know in the Netherlands, where I live, that's a lot better. I think the UK is pretty good as well. But obviously it is a big impact to have very frequent visits, and especially, of course, in rare diseases where, as I said, the trial sites are often big university hospitals in the big cities. So very often patients have to travel far to get to the trial site. Another very important benefit is that it's more comfortable, especially for children. Again, Dan talked about that this morning, where he gave really good examples of his child being much more stressed in a hospital setting, and just giving different results than in a home setting. And also the travel to a trial site, patients with neuromuscular diseases will probably perform much less in their walk test or any other physical test that they need to perform after they've first had to travel for a couple of hours instead of just being in a home setting. So those are very, very important benefits. Some downfalls may be having at least the feeling that there is less interactions with the site staff, maybe having feeling of getting less attention. I know some families really like to get the warm and fuzzy feeling being at the hospital with people they know and being taken care of, and maybe they will miss that when everything is in the home setting. I've heard stories from some families, again, especially with younger children, who actually do not like to have a nurse come into their home to, for instance, take blood samples or do other assessments which are burdensome, painful, uncomfortable for the child, because they really want to keep the safe setting of the home environment for the child, so that the child knows the difference. Okay, when I go into the hospital, yes, I know that needles will be stuck in me, and okay, that's what I have to accept. But the home is a safe environment where I won't get any painful injections or painful assessments. So that is really something to keep in mind. And obviously for some families, I think especially older patients, the whole technology thing will be more of a challenge. For the clinical trial staff and also the sponsors, so the pharma and biotech companies who are developing the drugs, there are also positives and potential negatives. On the positive side, what I've also experienced in the last few years, seeing that the decentralized setup is becoming more and more normal, is that it definitely leads to increased patient recruitment and retention, because the burden on the patients is generally seen as lower or more acceptable. So obviously patients will be, and families, parents will be more intent on participating in a trial and also staying in the trial for a longer duration. Something that I've mentioned earlier, data will be more real life instead of just the snapshot at the moment of the hospital visit, where you don't know what's been going on that day, and the travel may have been tiring or difficult. So it probably gives better and more reliable data. It's more efficient for the trial staff, less time consuming, although of course things need to be arranged, but some of the burden is being taken, for instance, by home care nurses, which will be usually a commercial company providing the home care nurses. So we do see that in the university hospitals, and I know also, especially in the UK, NHS is of course under huge pressure. So very often clinical trials are not being run by hospitals because of lack of staff, lack of resources. So if you can decrease the amount of resources needed at the trial site by making a study more decentralized, that will hopefully also create more space for clinical trials to be performed in those hospitals. The site staff does need to be a bit tech savvy, although there are of course always services, help desk services, etc. But it helps if they understand the technology a little bit. And they might have the feeling that they have less control over the patients and their data collection. But I think that is really a matter of getting used to the decentralized setup more over time. Then moving on to COVID. So obviously the impact of COVID on rare disease clinical trials, and not only rare disease clinical trials, all clinical trials, has been huge. As Rick said in his introduction, quite a lot of trials have been put on hold because of the COVID restrictions. Actually, what I've seen from experience, at that time I was still working in a CRO specialized in rare disease studies. And we actually managed to have hardly any studies put on hold. With one or two exceptions, but all others we were able to continue with some adaptations, or in some cases quite significant adaptations. And when I saw some statistics a couple of probably 2-3 months ago from other CROs that are managing more common disease clinical trials, where they had, I think, 2/3 of all their studies put on hold. And for us in the rare disease space, it was less than 5%. So I think that's great, but in my opinion, that's also because the unmet medical need is so much higher in rare diseases that both patients and study sites and sponsors are so much more motivated to carry on despite all the challenges that COVID put on us. While in more common diseases where there are already good therapies on the market, it's much easier to say, oh, you know what, let's just put this trial on hold for a couple of months and we'll see when things improve. So trials were forced to implement ad hoc changes to the study setup due to travel restrictions and hospital lockdowns, where site visits, and here I mean traditional trials, the non-decentralized trials. So site visits had to be replaced by home visits or telemedicine, and study medication had to suddenly be delivered to patient homes. And that sounds very easy, but you have to keep in mind that a lot of study medication has to be kept at a certain temperature, -20 or even colder, or refrigerated. And you need to make sure that the study medication really gets to the right place. So you need special courier services that you can trust and that can really make sure that the study medication is kept at the right conditions until it reaches the patient's home. So I know that the companies providing home care services have seen their businesses, increase by tenfold over the last year. They've been very, very busy, but it has generally worked very well. And we are getting very positive feedback from patients that were in these traditional design trials before COVID, and then suddenly things had to change and it became more decentralized. And generally patients are very happy with those changes, and happy that the trial could continue, of course. That's even more important. So we have seen a huge increase in the acceptance of a decentralized setup by study sites and authorities. I think patients were already very much willing to go to the more decentralized approach, but there was always a bit of some doubts, both from the study sites and also the authorities. But now they were basically forced to take this approach, and that has made a huge difference. So I've heard some experts say that the COVID pandemic has actually shifted the industry from the way we thought clinical trials would be in 2030 to 2020, to this year. So we've actually made a jump of 10 years because of COVID. I think we can conclude that COVID, of course, is causing horrible things, but at least this is, in my opinion, something positive coming out of the pandemic. And the prediction by CenterWatch is that 73% of sites will use telemedicine and a more decentralized approach after COVID, compared with 28% before and 64% during. So there's still growth to be obtained. So in conclusion, in my opinion, all future rare disease trials should consider the possibilities for a decentralized approach. And I'm saying this especially for rare disease trials because the patients are so much scattered and the travel time to the expert site is usually so high. Then obviously engaging patients and sites during the planning and conduct of decentralized trials is really important. It can ensure that the research goals are aligned with the needs of the patients and their caregivers, enhance patient satisfaction and engagement, and thereby improve patient recruitment and retention. And ideally, we should always strive for a hybrid model because of what I said before. Many patients really like having a nurse come into their home, so they have to travel less. But some patients or some families don't want a healthcare professional coming into their home to keep their home kind of a safe environment. So giving patients the option or a mixed model that they might come into the hospital, into the study site, maybe once every couple of months, but the in-between visits will be at home to ease the burden of travel. That is what I call a hybrid model where patients have a choice, and that really allows patients and their caregivers to make their own choices regarding the location of the study visits. And I think that is really the ideal we should strive for. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I know I've taken up a bit more time than I promised Rick, but I know we had more time. So if there are any questions for now, and I think Rick has kept an eye on questions.
Absolutely, Krista, thank you so much. That was a really nice talk, taking us right through the kind of landscape and the journey we've been on this year with clinical trials. So I really appreciate that. A few things I'd like to ask, and a few things starting to appear in the chat box as well, which is great. First up, I mean, I've had a bit of insight around clinical trials myself just lately, and I was interested to see how the kind of ethics approvals for these type of decentralized trials are working, and what the kind of reaction is from those ethics boards towards implementing these types of measures in clinical trial design.
Yeah, so that is really something that has changed over the last year. Both the MHRA and ethics committees were always a little skeptical about decentralized trials. But once COVID hit us, many authorities in US and Europe, and also the MHRA in the UK, deployed guidelines to allow much more things than were previously allowed, because they also understood that otherwise many studies had to be put on hold. So things like remote consent was something that was really difficult to get approved in the past, and now that has been accepted, as long as, of course, as you use the right technology, which is GDPR safe, and all other regulations taken into account. And the same holds true for home nurses. The EMA has actually issued a guideline that was before COVID, I think 2 years ago, about home nursing, that yes, it is acceptable, but you need to take into account certain regulations. You need to make sure, obviously, that the staff is qualified and is trained on the study procedures, and that the data collection is done in the right way, is GDPR approved. obviously that the patient's safety is taken into account. So if there's a nurse going into a home and they get information about what we call a serious adverse event, so a serious medical event, obviously they should not just write it down and send it on to the site and wait until someone looks at it. There have to be processes in place that if they find something like that, they immediately pick up the phone and call the responsible physician at the study site, etc. So there are a lot of rules in place to safeguard the patient of the safety of the patient. But as long as you take those things into account and present that to the ethics committee and the MHRA, generally it's accepted. And one more thing to say about this, that's of course also a trend, especially in regards to ethics committees, that they really like you to show that you've been engaging with the patient community during the setup of your study. So if you can tell them, we have this partly decentralized setup, we discussed it with the patients, and they really feel this is better for the patient community, then that will greatly improve your chances of having it accepted.
Brilliant. Thanks, Krista. That's great. The other question I was just going to touch on, which I think you've kind of hinted at already, really, was what you've seen as the trend in uptake of this. Obviously, you mentioned this leap forward in time, this decade leap that's happened due to COVID. And do you think, where was the trend prior to that in terms of the uptake of this, and where do you think it would go? Well, as much as there will be a post-COVID.
Yeah, so the trend was definitely already there. I've personally seen this in the last, I would say, 2 years, really becoming more and more of a trend. But as with all things in the pharma world, the pharmaceutical world is a very conservative world. So as with all trends, it takes years. It's a very slow uptake, and having this surge due to COVID, is making a huge difference. I think without COVID, the pace would remain to be very slow. And now with COVID, we've had this huge increase, and I think it will now continue where, I think in 5 years' time, all trials won't be fully decentralized, because that is in most cases not possible, as I pointed out, but at least partly. And what I've also seen, a study protocol for a rare disease study very recently sent to me. I was so happy to see that the protocol already included a combination of hospital visits, home visits, and telemedicine visits, where in the past it would always be me pointing out to sponsors, saying, what about telemedicine? What about home visits? And they would be like, oh, well, I don't know. And but now they are already suggesting it themselves, which I think is a really good trend.
Absolutely. Krista, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on the future trials, then Krista and I will be joined by a few other people in a panel after this session. So guys, please do drop in there. But for now, Krista, thank you very much. We may hear more from you a little bit later. So at that point, I'd like to welcome our second speaker to the stage. Following off Krista's talk, what we really wanted to have was some talk that could illustrate how this is delivered in practice, a real case study to highlight the deployment of some of these measures, these remote trials, these decentralized trial structures in action. And I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Penny Hogarth to the showcase and to the stage today. So Penny is out in Oregon and joining us at some ungodly hour. So thank you so much for doing that, Penny. And is going to share with us her experience and work on setting up a trial for PCAN, a rare condition, using some of these approaches before COVID, and actually how that's obviously had a big positive benefit to the work she's doing now. So Penny, I'm really glad to have you here, and please do take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try and share my screen. It's worked before. Sorry. So I'm clicking share screen. Oh, there we go. Let's see. There
Perfect.
we go. Sorry about that.
Not a problem, Penny. Thank you. You're sharing and we can see you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to the organizers of this meeting for inviting me to talk about our clinical trial. I'd love to tell you that this is a story of a clinical trial that was artfully planned to run smoothly despite a pandemic, but that isn't exactly true. Our novel remote design was intended to meet the needs. It was put in place to meet the needs of a very fragile, ultra rare disease population. So we did plan. It just so happened that it was perfectly designed to cope with all the challenges that COVID-19 could throw at us. So our rare disease is probably like many of yours listening today. It is actually an ultra rare disease. It's a 1 in a million albino zebra, if you like. It goes by the acronym PCAN, and it's caused by a misspelling in the gene that allows the body, and especially the brain, to use one of the B vitamins to make an essential chemical called coenzyme A. The disease affects both children and adults, but it's especially cruel in children, as you can probably glean from this photograph of one of our patients, where it causes these really awful twisting, writhing movements that can be so severe. Sometimes kids even break bones just in the face of the force of the movements. And cognition stays pretty much intact in this disease. So as you can imagine, it causes true suffering in the real sense of the word, particularly in children, which is an especially heartbreaking feature of the disease. So we've developed a product that is intended to bypass this block in metabolism, and it seems to correct the metabolic problem in mice with PCAN. And so we sought to find a way to test it in children and adults with the disease. Okay, so now I'm going to whip through 25 years of history in about a minute. So don't blink or you'll miss it. So this is Susan Hayflick, my collaborator. And about 25 years ago, she met a family in the Amish community. This is an isolated Christian community that shuns technology and vehicles and does still seek medical care when they need to, but they are very conservative in terms of their interactions with society. She met a family that had 3 daughters affected with this disease, but at the time, very little was known about it. And so she was just out of her fellowship training. She made her career around trying to figure out this disease. So she wrote a grant and she set about finding the gene for the disease. And then she wrote another grant with collaborators in San Francisco. And she made a mouse model with PCAN. And then she also started setting about with this mouse model and an understanding of what the gene was. She set about with putting a lab group together to understand the underpinnings of this disease, what caused it. It was already known that it was in a vitamin metabolic pathway. So she had a head start there, but there was a lot to understand, and frankly, there still is. I came along and joined the group shortly after the gene discovery and got very involved with this disorder as a neurologist, working with Susan. And we set about together, putting together a clinical team, genetic counselors, clinical coordinators, to start doing natural history studies while she continued work in the lab with her group, particularly Su Young Jong, who is shown here, who really helped us to figure out some of the underpinnings of this disease. And we wrote a few more grants, but it was taking too long because we found a compound that kind of bypassed this metabolic defect, and it seemed to fix the disease in the mice. And so we really wanted to get on with this and move it into children and adults with disease. So we actually started a foundation, the Spoonbill Foundation, in concert with colleagues in the Netherlands who started a sister foundation called Stichting Lepelaar. And we partnered really with the family community. This really was a true collaborative fundraising effort with this ultra rare disease community who did everything from bake sales to golf tournaments to build a custom house with donated time and materials and sell it. And they raised quite a lot of money to help us start to synthesize this molecule while we wrote more grants. And finally, the National Institutes of Health funded us to do a phase 2 study of a vitamin metabolite for pecan, this compound that we've been able to make. So this is a phase 2 trial. It's designed to tell us whether the study product is safe. Is it well tolerated without serious side effects? And does it change a biological measure of disease? We, throughout the planning of this trial, we've worked closely with the regulatory agencies, with the FDA in the US, over several years in planning the study. And we also worked, as Krista mentioned, very closely with the family community as we started to design this study. It was planned for 51 participants. And remember, this is a 1 in a million disease, with each participant intended to be in the trial for 2 years, is how it was originally designed. So we wanted to do this study entirely remotely for a whole bunch of reasons, but by far the most compelling was, as has been discussed in the first talk, it was to reduce the burden of study participation for our very fragile population. It had been our observation that people with pecan, especially those who are more severely affected, namely the children, really don't do well with the stress of travel and coming into major medical centers. Sometimes it would precipitate what's called a dystonic crisis and put them in the hospital. They're a very brittle, fragile population. And so because we had a study product that is essentially identical to a normal vitamin metabolite in the body, we made the case to the regulatory agencies, who at the time were not particularly thrilled about the idea of an entirely remote trial. But we made the case that because our study product was predicted to have very low toxicity, the funding and the regulatory agencies bought into the idea that this trial could be done with the participants remaining in their own communities, that this would reduce risk, reduce burden, would not compromise safety. We stayed in very close touch with the community via our already established website. And we had Facebook and Twitter accounts, which thankfully I'm not responsible for. And as the study was being developed and ramping up to start, we maintained a pretty close communication using these means with the community. And there were some pluses and minuses to this ongoing close communication, which I can discuss later if people are interested to hear my perspectives on that. But we got input on the design, as I mentioned, and we got very high enthusiasm from the community for this idea of a remote clinical trial, a low impact remote clinical trial. And that in turn was important for our funding agencies to hear, that we had worked collaboratively with the patient and family community. We encouraged folks to gather everything they'd need without delay. There's a few pluses and minuses there as well that we can talk about. We had a formal pre-screening process in place to establish preliminary eligibility for the study. And then we would have an initial phone call and then send this private unique link from our fully compliant database that would link to a videotape that was kind of a pre-consent videotape. And it would give a fairly detailed overview of the trial. And then people were invited to affirm their interest after they had watched this videotape. Then after this, we conducted the consent via phone. So they were sent an electronic version of the consent form, but we actually did the consent process with them, with the consent in front of them electronically and with us on the phone. And we would talk through everything. That opportunity to ask questions in real time we felt was very important. And then while the person was still connected to us on the phone, we would send them a link to the electronic version of the consent that could be signed. They could sign on their iPad, their phone, their computer. It's a fully compliant signature with an audit trail, all of the requirements for the regulatory agencies to ensure that this is a valid consent. And then it would be transmitted back to us while we were still on the phone. So we could see that, yes, indeed, we had a signed consent from this participant. Then next, we would send out all of the blood draw kits for the screening labs. And once all the blood draws were complete and the final eligibility was confirmed, we would send another link to another videotape, another online video that would explain everything they needed to know about the study product. So what to expect in the box they were going to receive, how to dose it, including, things that we figured out ourselves, like you have to inject a little bit of air into the bottle when it's full. Otherwise you get too big of a suction on the syringe and it pulls the dose back into the bottle. But you can't inject too much air or the bottle will explode. A few little subtleties like that. And then we told them how they needed to store it. It was actually a refrigerated product, at least initially, until we got more stability data. And how they would track and document any side effects, when to contact us, any deviations from their usual dosing protocol, and what and when to ship products, materials back to us, including lab supplies. So the way we handled safety labs and the biomarker labs that we were drawing, we, again, Krista, you set up this talk very nicely. We had to set up a national contract with a major laboratory supplier. We identified labs in each participant's community. This is one of the largest contractors, laboratories in the United States. And so we hoped that we would be able to find a lab close to each participant. And in the vast majority of cases, we did. There were certainly some where we didn't. And in those cases, we made arrangements with one-off labs. It was a great deal of contracting, negotiating, pleading for lower rates because we were paying for this out of federal funding and donated funds. And so it was quite a performance to try to get the laboratory stuff in place. But we did for every participant. Providers in rare cases were helping us as they needed to. And then participants would get labs drawn at set intervals. We would be calling them to remind them. We had a centralized single email that people got very much in the habit of emailing with any questions. That is monitored continuously through the weekends, evenings, everything. And phone lines are monitored too. I would just mention here that most, but not all people are internet or smartphone connected. And particularly for us, there is a slight preponderance of people with PCAN in this Amish community. And it was very important to us because they had played such a key role in the gene discovery. And because we were committed to trying to bring this remote trial to as broad a swath of people as we possibly could. The idea was that people should be able to participate in clinical research if they wanted to. So we went to the most extraordinary lengths, worked very closely with the Amish providers, who are a pretty dedicated bunch. And we have, I think now, 6 or more people in the Amish community around the country participating in the clinical trial. This required things like our scheduling a specific, they don't have phones in their house usually, but there is usually a single pole phone, which literally means a phone on a pole in the community. And we would schedule a specific time that would have to be scheduled by snail mail. The family would be standing by that pole phone at the designated time, and we would talk them through the consent process. And then usually they could find, the provider would take the consent form, fax it back to us. We had to deal with refrigeration because they don't have electricity, and we were worried about our product being refrigerated reliably. Well, it turns out the Amish know all about this. They have very steady temperature ice boxes, which is literally an ice box. And that worked pretty well. So it's been quite an interesting journey. And then having got all this underway, we started the clinical trial in December of 2019, so nearly a year ago, just as COVID was getting started in Italy. And then it really ramped up in the US. And as you know, probably from the news, it is in full swing now. And so what has changed in our trial, in the conduct of a trial in the face of COVID-19? Really remarkably little. And it has just been such a pleasure to see this just continue almost seamlessly, largely because we were running it. We were already running it as a clinical trial. Really, the only thing that changed is our staff, and you can see them in some of these photographs, me up in the corner, and our staff scattered around the Portland area. Mostly we're working from home, calling and communicating, having communications with participants. We have specific coordinators who come into the lab every 2 weeks to do these massive shipments of study product. They have to socially distance and wear masks and do the whole thing, sanitize everything before and after. But it has really gone remarkably smoothly. We are working closely with colleagues at the Food Innovation Center, which is an agricultural experiment station from Oregon State University, which is distinct from our university. They're shown here at the bottom in their gear. This was pre-pandemic when they formulate the product each 2 weeks and get bottles to our research pharmacy, and we pick them up and then pack them up for shipment. So it's been really lovely to see it continue. We do have permission from these two participants, and a young adult participant and one of our kiddos, taking their syrup, which is strawberry flavored and has been received quite enthusiastically. So one major reason that clinical trials in rare diseases, in fact, in any disease, but particularly in rare diseases, I think, fail is because they don't enroll enough participants. As you've been hearing throughout this conference, the barriers are huge to clinical trial participation. And perhaps the greatest of those is the requirement to travel to a study center, often over long distances. And in the US, this is especially acute because we have this enormous country. And so getting to a study center, even if you have a multi-center clinical trial, chances are you're going to be traveling hundreds, if not thousands of miles. And this burden is magnified in the face of the disabilities that accompany most rare diseases, particularly neurologic diseases, I would say. You've already heard from Krista the kind of the ancillary fallout of that. Parents needing to leave other children, not being able to get time off work, if they have to fly across the country, that is quite substantial time. Flying with a child is never easy, even if you have a healthy child. It is almost impossible to imagine with a disabled child, particularly long flights. And so if ours had been a typical clinical trial, this is what the curve would look like. So this is a fairly typical expected versus actual enrollment study graph that one would see. On the vertical axis is the number of participants that are hoped to enroll. Our target was 51, which was based on a power analysis. And if we had been a typical, and we gave ourselves 2 years to enroll 51 participants, which is not unreasonable for an ultra rare disease like ours. If ours had been a typical trial, we would have taken 2 years, and based on the data that is out there, we at best would have enrolled maybe 70% of our target. That's how it goes in most cases. What actually happened in our clinical trial was this. So we gave ourselves 2 years. We fully enrolled the trial in 3.5 months. It was just staggering. It nearly killed us all. But this was partly a consequence of having been so communicative with the community and so closely connected to the rare disease community. So over an extended time that it took to get this trial funded and up and running, people were really ready, and we were really ready to enroll them. And so we enrolled very quickly. I think in retrospect, probably a bit too quickly because it did nearly kill us. But we got up to our 51 participants in 3.5 months. And what this has meant is that we have been able to expand enrollment. We kept it open. We went back to the FDA. We submitted in the NIH and put a new protocol amendment in. We expanded enrollment, increased our power in the trial, and we were able to extend the duration of the trial. Remember, we were planning on each participant having 2 years. Now we will be able to follow them for 3 years on study product because of this rapid early enrollment. So this is one of the most, sort of compelling visuals, I think, for the success of a remote clinical trial. So I do want to mention what's happening next. So we have been planning for a while to extend the trial to other countries. And Professor Dr. Manju Kurian, who I think may be listening, with her Pediatric Neurology Clinical Research Fellow colleague, Dr. Rob Spall, are planning to adopt essentially the same design and to replicate it in the United Kingdom. This is not exactly, it's not going to be a multi-center trial that we are running. They are running it independently. They have funding from LifeArc with support from the Great Ormond Street Hospital charity and support from the hospital itself. And they will be running essentially an identical clinical trial in the not too distant future. They are just in the process of ramping up. One of the wonderful things is that because of our experience over the last year, we have sort of tested all of the systems and can help them kind of get through some of the potential hurdles before they hit them. And so I think this is going to be a lovely partnership. Manju has been a long-standing collaborator of ours for many years, and it will be a real joy to see this trial get going in Europe. There's also a trial planned in the Netherlands that will be a little different in design. So I just want to acknowledge my funders, most notably the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the funding from both the Spoonbill Foundation and Lepelaar Stichting, which really has come from largely from families with PCAN. They have done, I mean, just the most amazing job in raising money, and we would not have been able to get this trial underway had they not funded the work that got us through the synthesis, which was one of the largest costs and most time-consuming parts of this whole project. We've also had funding along the way from these other foundations, from my Children's Hospital in Oregon and the NBA Disorders Association and Oak Tree at OHSU. This is my long-standing collaborator and partner, Dr. Susan Hayflick. When we are not working full-time on this disease, which we do most of the time, we occasionally take time out to go for a hike in one of our beautiful rainforests. And I just want to thank our rare disease patient and family community and my wonderful group here on Rare Disease Day, wearing their zebra scarves. So with that, I'll end and take some questions. How did I do on time?
Penny, it was a brilliant talk and really good on time as well. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it. I found it fascinating, and seeing all the work you put in there has been quite impressive. I was particularly interested by the lengths you went to make sure we engaged that Amish community and to bring them into the trial. I think that was really impressive and fascinating to hear about. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. A couple of different things I could ask, really. I'd like to just start touching on what your hopes are for the next stage in the trial. You know, how are you thinking you might be able to take this forward beyond the phase 2? Is it going to be a phase 3? Is your efficacy marker good enough? And how you'd like this to reach patients ultimately, if on that big if things go well?
Yeah. So again, this is a phase 2 study. It's safety and tolerability. And then we have this biomarker, because we have been very closely engaged with the Food and Drug Administration in the US now really for several years as this whole thing has developed. We do have some buy-in for the agency for the biomarker being a surrogate marker. We are also looking at clinical measures, but in the setting of a long-standing online and telephone, again, remotely conducted natural history study. We are doing a modeling approach to look at natural history data before and after the intervention. And so it was a requirement of the clinical trial that our participants be enrolled in the natural history study. Many, but not all, will have several years of data in the natural history study. And one of the things that I would just say to the rare disease advocacy groups out there is, for those of you that are waiting for the first therapeutic to come along, or even for the second or third therapeutic agent to come along, there is nothing better that you can do with that very frustrating period than engage with natural history studies, or if there's not one going in your disease, to work with the clinicians and partners, maybe with your own community, to get a robust natural history study going, to understand what's involved and to get one going. There are ways to do this remotely, no better time than now. And the regulatory agencies increasingly are taking a pretty hard line about wanting to see natural history data in the setting of therapeutic agents being developed. And so that's something you can do, those of you that are waiting patiently for that first therapeutic. It feels hard to do that, and it is hard, but it is so valuable, essential, in fact.
Yeah, no, I echo that. I couldn't agree more, Penny. Thank you for sharing that point. You mentioned in your talk, you left a little breadcrumb, the use of social media and some of your thoughts on how that's worked for you, pros and cons. And part of me thinks I should send to the end to get everyone's opinion, but I'm keen just to touch on it now, and I'd love to get your thoughts on. the strengths and weaknesses of using that for
It would be
you.
good to hear others' perspective, but I have to say, social media is the greatest of things for the rare disease community, and it is the worst of things in many ways. It is the most amazing support. You can find somebody who's heard of your disease and who can share experiences. You can feel like you have a connection that you might otherwise never have. So that is the greatest of things. The worst of things is that sometimes I think we're living in a culture of sort of oversharing, and it can get up people's anxiety, particularly now when we're all trapped with our phones and our iPads and our Twitter accounts and our Facebook accounts and our Instagrams, and compulsively engaging with social media. I think when you are worried about your child or about yourself, sometimes I think that can amp up the anxiety, and that is something that I think has been exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. For the clinical trial perspective, it is a bit of a liability, and it was something that I should have seen but didn't fully, in that these Facebook groups, they're private Facebook groups that aren't anything to do with our sort of sponsored Facebook group that we have. Facebook page. The private Facebook patient groups, family groups, they compare notes all the time about how they are doing, how their child is doing, and is their kid on placebo, is their kid on active compound, and it is, it's a bit of a liability. The whole point of a blinded study is that you are blind to what you're on, and you can remain blind even through all of the chatter. You will be blind through all of the chatter as to whether you're on placebo or active compound, but it does compromise that. And at least one clinical trial in this disease has failed because everybody improved. There was such a high expectation. Whether that was exacerbated, including the placebo group, whether that was exacerbated because of social media effects, I'm not sure. But I would warrant that it probably does have a role.
Can I make
something else?
Comment?
Go ahead, please do.
Rick and Penny. Yeah, that is definitely something that we've seen over the last couple of years becoming an increasing liability in clinical trials. And what in the last year or so, what we've started doing is actually explaining this very clearly to the patients and their families during the informed consent process, and actually adding a line in the informed consent form. Obviously, informed consent is not a binding contract, but still putting a clear phrase in the informed consent form about this, and actually asking patients and families to not disclose, if they are on a clinical trial, to not disclose trial-related information on social media. And I'm not saying that that will, ensure that nobody will do this, but hopefully it will at least make people realize that at the end of the day, if a trial fails because of that, they will carry the consequences. So, it's to their benefit to make sure the trial remains blinded, and to help to achieve that by not sharing clinical trial related information on social media.
I wish we had addressed that early on. It was something that I didn't really cotton on to until we were well underway. And, it's a very challenging thing that we'll have to see how it all plays out. So
thanks for coming on that, Krista, and Penny, thank you for sharing that. I think the challenge around that blinding aspect in clinical trials is a tough one, and social media has done a huge amount for the rare disease community. It's clear to see, but that this is a space where a really careful piece of communication around the function of clinical trials, the understanding of the blinding and the reasons why it's needed for statistics and to prove the effect, to provide the evidence that's needed is crucial. Thank you so much. I'm really keen to move on to the next talk now, but I hope we can bring you both in again a little bit at the end if you're able to stay, so we can have some more discussion. But I thought that was fascinating and really appreciate your time. So yeah, I'll move on to our final speaker within this little bit of our session now. So we're going to kind of end this webinar where we started our first webinar with Lara Bloom. I'm really very pleased to welcome back. So as you'll know from for those of you who are in our first day session, Lara is CEO of the Ehlers-Danlos Society, and Lara's been working not specifically on a clinical trial, but on a piece of research, and that piece of research really focuses on a need to recruit a huge number of patients, the patient community, quite quickly. And as I understand it, it was all ticking over and COVID hit. And so how do you go on about recruiting people into such a study during the time of COVID? So that is something Lara's going to share with us, her experiences there. And I'm really pleased to welcome you back, Lara. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay, just share my screen with you all. So I'm going to talk to you today about the HEDGE study and enrolling for a research study like this in a virtual world. So HEDGE, the Hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Genetic Evaluation. Gotta love an acronym. So what we are doing is searching for the genetic cause, or more likely causes, for hypermobile EDS. There's 14 types of EDS, and hypermobile form is the most prevalent, and it's the only one that we don't have a genetic marker for. So this study is going to tell us a lot that we don't know. And even if it doesn't tell us the genetic causes or cause, it will at least tell us that we can't find one. So we need to then look elsewhere. So it's a hugely important study for our community. And we are incredibly lucky to have $2 million pledged towards the HEDGE study to try and find these answers. So we launched this in 2018, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the timeline shortly. So the target is to whole genome sequence 1,000 people with the same phenotype from around the world. So no mean feat. And it's quite unusual and unique for a nonprofit to be leading this kind of research study. But I think it just shows the worth and how it can be done, and how patient involvement can really lead to a lot of progression, a lot of great answers, and things being done a little bit differently maybe to if it was an institution that we normally think of leading this kind of study. So this is how the timeline looked. So when we got the first million pledged, we very, very quickly brought together all the world's leading experts who had previously been working in silos to try and find the same answers. And we had our first HEDGE network meeting in New York in March. In August of 2018, we launched the EDS and HSD Global Registry, and that was launched primarily to support the enrollment of those 1,000 people into the study. In April 2019, saw the first in-person HEDGE screening. And what we did is brought people to see medical professionals who assessed them for the 2017 criteria and other research criteria that were needed to get into the study. And so really it needed to be done in person, also we thought. In June, we did further screenings in London and Baltimore, in July in Nashville, in September in Rome, in October, Baltimore, Indianapolis, and Chicago, in November in Edinburgh, and in January in New York, and in February in Ghent and London. So we were really getting around the world. And then February 2020, that date's wrong there, 2020, COVID-19 hit us all. And it was actually that Ghent and London screening, which was actually some of the last travel or anything that we've done in person as a society. So at that point, we had a total of 475 people enrolled in person towards that 1,000 target. So how do we recruit the remaining 525 during a global pandemic? So we regrouped and we planned and we tried to adapt to the new normal. And we realized that this could be done, with telehealth getting more and more recognized as a really valuable resource. We thought people could upload their medical records and their reports and their diagnostic letters, photographs, scans, everything in between into the global registry, this kind of GDPR, HIPAA compliant, secure space where people could put that information. And then we've got support from health professional volunteers, members of our staff, members of the network, to assist in screening these documents to see if they fulfill the criteria. And then if people did fulfill the criteria, we are arranging blood draws at home. And all of the companies we're using are COVID secure, using full PPE, and to give us real comfort that that's going to be done in the right way. And of course, to enable us to reach that 1,000. So as always, we say our strength begins with hope. We've remained hopeful in these extremely challenging times. And I'm pleased to say that despite everything, we are still on track to hopefully start that sequencing in spring of next year, followed by the analysis. So we're really, really excited to bring us bring you the results from that study and see where it leads to. If anyone has any questions about this or anything else, here's my contact details. You can reach out to me or the Society at any time. And thank you again to Find a Cure for the opportunity to share with you the information about the hedge study.
Thanks so much, Lara. It's hugely impressive to get to that far down in an impressive project anyway, and then have to suddenly make that switch. And the whole session I had the classic phrase, necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? And that really seems to be driving this kind of space in research. I'd love to just get your thoughts on how have people reacted to this sudden shift? I mean, what has been the response to those people who are trying to join this, and how are they feeling about the submissions they're making and the home blood draws and that side of it?
So people have reacted really well. I think the biggest thing is that it enables us to recruit from so many different places and countries, whereas previously it was just based on where we were doing an event and where we could get to in person. And you can see that that was really Europe and US focused. And now there's really, I think there's a few countries where we can't do the at-home blood draws, but really it's, I think 2 or 3 out of all of the countries around the world. Yeah. So it's really exciting to see that we'll actually have a more diverse population on there. And that to me is wonderful and would not have happened if things were on track and we weren't living through this time. So it's great. And people have responded really well. You know, I think, you know, as with everything, you're going to reach people that you never would have reached. And then there's going to be a handful that would have been much more comfortable doing in person, not having to use technology, not having to use, you know, rely so heavily on the registry. But, you know, you have to balance it out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. And have you had to use, you talked about your translation services and that type of thing when you're trying to build the communication around the work you're doing generally. Is that something that's obviously fed through to this project as well? And have you been able to reach out to a lot of countries using those facilities?
Yeah, so currently the registry is in English, so there's been a lot of Google Translate when people are emailing us, but we have accelerated getting the registry translated into about 5 or 6 different languages, and we hope that by the beginning of next year that will be done. It may be a little bit late for the recruitment phase of this, but it certainly will help other studies that we do in the future where we want to reach everyone we can.
That's amazing. And the last one, I'll just focus on you there, is have you got an idea of what's next? Because it feels like, you know, this is proving successful already. So is there that hope to push on beyond this? And has that shift to online actually changed your cost base in such a way that you might be able to expand the people you're reaching, or has it kind of weighed out and balanced it?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think, you know, as ever, I'm always so ambitious as to how much we can do and how many people we can reach. I want more money, and, you know, the team looks at me with fear, like we're just so at capacity. So I think it has to, you know, be done realistically. But I think what this has shown us is the capacity of the registry, for example, in a non-profit leading that kind of research study, as long as you have IRB, you know, approval. And so I think the next big study for us that we would like to lead is a really large-scale global natural history study, and we're really excited to do that, hopefully towards the end of this year, at the end of next year, and that will be done completely virtually. Sorry, my dog in the background. You know, relying on uploading people's records and things like that. So exciting times, lots of opportunity.
Absolutely. That's amazing. Thank you, Lara. I really appreciate that. So at this stage, we've got a few minutes left, and I just wonder if I can bring maybe Penny and Krista back in, and we'll have a little discussion with the panelists, the speakers from this session. And I'd maybe just come back to you, Lara, briefly on that question that both Krista and Penny have touched on your thoughts on the kind of role of social media might play in this realm of research versus, you know, the connectivity that's crucial for rare diseases, and if you have any reflections on that at all.
So I've always thought social media is just so vitally important in everything in this area, because it's your shop window, it's your bridge to the community. Research is no exception. So, you know, for years now, we've offered a simple form on our website that allows researchers to share surveys with our community, and as long as they've got an IRB. And that survey then gets put out into our community on social media, on all of our platforms and our website. So we've been using that anyway, and we plan to absolutely continue to do that, because you're just reaching, you know, on our page, which is one disease area, we're reaching close to 100,000 people from around the world.
Yeah.
Why would you not utilize the capacity to get those numbers?
Absolutely. No, thank you, Laura. That's brilliant. I wanted to just touch a little bit with you all on what your perception of the impact of COVID-19 on rare disease research and trials has been, because I've heard a range of different views, and I think broadly speaking, there is a sense that it's clearly slowed things up and halted things, but there has been this upsurge in innovation and a willingness to do things differently that has kept things going. And there are certainly sites where I think, as Krista mentioned, the huge unmet need that patients are facing has meant that centres have tried and found ways to keep trials going throughout lockdown. It's a tough question, but one I'm interested in just touching on with this audience and this panel. What have you seen in your communities, in your situation, to comment on that and to lead to an impact on the patients? So I don't know, Penny, if you have any thoughts on what you've seen in the US.
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's obviously huge costs to this pandemic, but I have to say, I think that the leap forward that Krista spoke to in her talk, that has been afforded by the pandemic, is ultimately going to be a boon to the rare disease community in particular. Because, you know, arguably, they are the ones that are most disadvantaged in the clinical trial setting because of geography and disability, and the combination of geography and disability. And I think, you know, trying to get virtual medicine rolling in a kind of comprehensive way was pushed by the pandemic. It was like trying to steer a battleship, and now it turns out that the battleship is actually more nimble than we thought. We were hearing for years, oh, we can do it in these isolated settings, and that's about as much as we're going to be able to do, and there's all these hurdles to overcome. Well, it's amazing, when faced with a pandemic, those hurdles fell away. People found ways to make things happen. And the downstream consequences of that, though I think they're going to take a little while to be realized, I think are going to enormously benefit the rare disease community when it comes to clinical trials. I think, you know, digital health and, you know, passive devices that people can wear in the home, digital technologies that allow measurements to be taken over time, virtual visits with providers, all of the things that we've been talking about, I think have been accelerated in the setting of COVID. So mostly upsides, I guess.
Thanks, Penny. Krista?
Yeah, so two things I would like to add to that. Firstly, I think there is a difference between US and Europe in this respect. US, because of the geography and, you know, patients having to really air travel often to expert sites, meant that the concept of decentralized trials and the technology behind it was further advanced before COVID hit us than in Europe, and more accepted as well. So I think there is a difference there. And the other point, which I was just reminded of by what Penny was saying just now, is that when you asked me before, Rick, about the acceptability by authorities and also by ethics committees, one thing is, of course, the acceptability of the study protocol, of the study setup and design. The other thing is the outcome. So when you talk about the mobile technology, having wearables and other things, equipment that can be done in the home, sometimes by the patients themselves, there are definitely still hurdles there. So the types of equipment being developed at the moment is huge. That's almost every week there are new sensors and wearables being commercialized, coming on the market. But having the data that is generated by those devices accepted in the dossier for getting your drug approved, that is still something. I'm not an expert in that. I know that at Aparito there are some people who have much more expertise in that, but that is something that I've noticed, and that is the reason why pharma companies, biotech companies are still a bit careful with using these wearables, implementing these wearables, because they are not sure if the data will be accepted by the authorities later on. So that is still something that really needs more work and more attention.
Thanks, Krista. And Lara, I don't know if you have any thoughts or reflections on this, but just interested to see if you did have any general feeling from what you've seen in the Ehlers-Danlos community and beyond in the work that you do.
Only to add, I mean, nothing really other than to say that I think from a patient point of view, the integration of wearables into kind of that, in those kind of insights is really something that they would be behind, because I think it's also something that they can control, something that they can see, that's transparent for them as well. And where we have seen wearables as a question, would you be willing to have that data used? It's pretty much always a yes. And so I think that this is quite an exciting area that is, we're kind of here, and I look forward to it probably accelerating very quickly over the next few years, and seeing ethics and everything else catching up with the need and want.
Absolutely. Thank you all. That's fantastic. I think what I'm going to do at this point is begin to wrap things up, because it's been a brilliant session. I've learned a huge amount and loved listening to all three of you, and I hope the audience feels the same. We've got some great comments in here and there, which is lovely to see. This is not, however, the end of our showcase, which is really good. We still have a trio of breakout sessions for you guys to enjoy, and then after that we're going to come back onto our main stage for a nice wrap-up plenary talk from Find a Cure's founders, Nick Thoreau and Tony Hall. So please do check that out, everybody watching, if you can, because it's just a moment for us to sum up and celebrate the end of our event. What I will also mention before we leave this webinar is that for everyone attending, we will be sharing a survey, a feedback survey going out to you all on email, hopefully tomorrow morning, and we would really appreciate you guys taking the time to fill that out and have a look at it. So this is a bit of a novel, new, risky endeavor for us. We feel like it's gone well, but we want to hear your opinions and thoughts. So please do make the effort and take the time for that. So with that, I'll just take a moment again to thank our three speakers today for what's been an exceptional session. Thank you all for listening.